Hey everyone! Tonight we're sliding quietly into a place where the air is thick with incense, where shadows of tall jars lean against walls painted in ochre, and where the flicker of oil lamps makes the linen strips on the table look like pale snakes coiled for a secret ritual. You're not just watching, you're inside the embalmer's chamber, and it smells like smoke and honey gone wrong, with the sour edge of desert heat clinging to every surface. You probably won't survive this, because if you were the one, lying on that stone table, chest opened, heart measured, lungs tugged away by hands that pretend to know what forever looks like, well, you'd already be halfway to eternity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Drop your location and the time in the comments. It's always wild to see where you're watching from. Now, turn down the lights, turn on the fan to some soothing music, and let's get going tonight. You shuffle closer, toes scuffing against cool stone, and it's impossible not to notice how carefully the embalmers look at each other before they move. They don't talk much, but when they do, it's in fragments, like one sentence spread across three men's mouths, never fully whole in the open air. You realize that's the point. No one is supposed to know the whole process, except a few. The chosen, the ones who swear their silence harder than their loyalty to Pharaoh. Secrets here aren't just whispered. They're stitched into the folds of linen, burned into the resin, locked away in jars that pretend to be simple but are anything but. Historians still debate whether the priests themselves truly understood every single step, or if knowledge was spread like a jigsaw puzzle, each worker only holding a single piece. Maybe that's why you can't pin down a recipe for immortality in any papyrus scroll, because if you wrote it down, you risked someone like you sneaking in centuries later and stealing the whole trick. And let's be honest, if YouTube existed in 1500 BCE, you know someone would have tried top 10 ways to mummify your uncle video, complete with clickbait jars and resin giveaways. The strangeness of it all presses into you when you watch. The jars lined up. They don't just hold organs. They hold voices at least. That's what the embalmers seem to believe. The liver jar hums with its own silence. The stomach jar sulks like a teenager grounded for eternity. The intestines jar sort of gurgles if you squint your imagination. You feel a chill crawl up your arms as you realize the heart isn't here. They pulled it out, weighed it against a feather, and decided whether the soul deserved Netflix or eternal dial-up connection in the afterlife. And while all this plays out, you can't help but notice the tiniest odd detail. The man with the knife wears a ring shaped like a frog. You can't unsee it. Was it luck? Was it fashion? Or maybe it was just his way of saying, yeah, I spend my nights removing kidneys, but I'm still quirky. The scene makes you remember how other civilizations handled death. Somewhere in medieval Europe, monks quietly salted corpses and debated whether the soul stuck around in the bones. Across the ocean in Peru, families sat with their mummified ancestors at dinner, as if Uncle Hori might suddenly ask for more potatoes. You catch yourself thinking how people everywhere invent rituals to tame the same problem. Death won't. Leave a forwarding address. The Egyptians just had better branding, with gold masks and pyramids instead of awkward poplocks. A moment lingers when you look again at the linen strips waiting to be wrapped. They look harmless, like bandages in your bathroom drawer, but you know once they touch a body here, they stop being cloth. They become walls, layers of secrecy, each loop locking in something the embalmers refuse to say aloud. You hear someone cough, a low rasp, and for a split second you think he looked at you directly, as if to say, yeah, you're seeing this, but you'll never really know. The longer you stay, the heavier your eyelids feel. Maybe it's the heat of the lamps. Maybe it's the rhythm of hands moving with deliberate slowness, like time itself got bored and stretched. And in the haze you realize, even with modern Science and all our fancy gadgets, we're still guessing about half of what these embalmers did. Were the powders they used imported from faraway deserts or ground up from local herbs? Did the resin seal the body or perfume the air for the gods? No one can agree, not even the cleverest archaeologists with PhDs and questionable coffee habits. The truth is stitched in the linen, sealed in the jars, and maybe, just maybe, meant to stay hidden. You drift deeper into the chamber, past the flicker of lamps, and the jars begin to loom taller, each one carved with faces that stare back at you, half human, half animal, as if they know something you don't. These are the canopic jars, the guardians of guts, the keepers of voices, and you can't help but feel like they're whispering when the firelight bends across their features. One holds the lungs, one the stomach, one the intestines, one the liver, and each is topped with a god's head baboon, jackal, falcon, human like an ancient security system designed to make sure your afterlife login credentials never expire. The oddest part is that the heart isn't here, not in any jar, because it had its own fate, measured on a cosmic scale against a feather, a test you definitely don't want to fail. Imagine failing a test in school, and instead of detention, your soul gets eaten by a crocodile monster. It's a whole new level of study hard or else. You step closer and notice the paint on the jars, faint lines of red, blue, and green, some flaking away after thousands of years, but still clinging on like stubborn graffiti. Historians still debate whether the colors held chemical significance. Were they protective pigments, coded like secret labels, or just decorative? No one can fully agree, and you realize that these jars aren't just containers, they're puzzles. The embalmers would never tell you exactly why this organ went here, and that one was discarded. Did they believe the brain mattered? Clearly not, since it was scooped out like a pumpkin and tossed. Meanwhile, the liver was treated like royalty. It makes you wonder if the Egyptians secretly loved barbecue and just couldn't let go of the idea of a sacred liver. You picture the embalmers crouched low, sliding the organs into jars with a kind of reverence, but also with speed, because the desert air wasn't exactly gentle. The heat would make everything decay quickly, and so they had to move like chefs in a frantic kitchen. Except instead of Gordon Ramsay screaming, "It's raw," there was a priest muttering prayers, making sure no one angered the gods. It strikes you as both clinical and mystical, like a hospital where half the staff are doctors and the other half are stage magicians. And it's not just Egypt. Your mind drifts across time to the ancient Chinchorro people of South America, who also preserved their dead, sometimes stuffing bodies with reeds or clay, layering on paint, and leaving the faces strangely mask-like. Or to medieval Europe, where monks sometimes boiled corpses so the bones could be cleaned and carried long distances, a process that was both practical and very awkward to explain if you stumbled into the monastery kitchen. Cultures everywhere have their own take on how to keep parts of you around, as if the body were a library, and no one could decide which books were worth shelving and which could be tossed into the fire. You find yourself staring at one jar in particular, the baboon-headed, one Hopi, the guardian of lungs. There's something unsettling about its round eyes, the way they seem to follow you, and you can't shake the odd detail that baboons were considered wise by Egyptians. Imagine trusting your lungs to a baboon. In today's terms, it's like handing your medical file to a guy in a monkey costume and just hoping he doesn't eat the paperwork. But here, it made sense. Every jar, every godhead, every organ mapped onto a cosmic system bigger than one life, bigger than one death. A structure meant to make sure chaos didn't win. Historians still debate whether everyone got the same treatment, or if the full deluxe package was reserved for pharaohs and the wealthy. Some mummies are missing jars entirely, their organs preserved inside the body instead. Was it thrift? Was it innovation? Or was it just someone cutting corners? like the ancient equivalent of buying store-brand cereal. The uncertainty makes you lean in closer, like the answer might be written in the dust. The longer you stare, the more you feel the rhythm of it. All the way the jars stand in a neat line, the way the embalmers move with unhurried precision, and the way silence itself seems to hum in the air. The jars aren't just storage. They're a kind of choir, each holding not only flesh but memory, like an eternal Spotify playlist of the body's greatest hits. And you, standing there, can't help but think how fragile it all really is. If one jar cracks, if one lid slips, if one god's head falls off, does the whole system collapse? It's like Jenga, but with your soul on the line. As your eyelids grow heavier, you sense that the jars aren't just watching. They're waiting, patient as sand, carrying secrets that even the most high-tech labs of today still haven't fully cracked. The paint flakes, the clay chips, but the mystery? That stays sealed inside, whispering from lungs that never breathed again, from levers that never filtered again, from stomachs that never hungered again, and yet somehow still hum with echoes. You can almost hear. You're still inside that workshop, and now the smell changes, sharp and smoky, the kind of scent that seeps into your hair and clings to your clothes long after you've left. A cocktail of resin, pitch, herbs, and something that burns your throat before you can name it. The embalmers are mixing recipes, and you realize quickly that these aren't just kitchen spices. This is chemistry, alchemy, maybe even trickery. And they're keeping their hands low, shielding their motions, like bartenders who don't want you stealing their secret cocktail. They crush natron, the desert's natural salt, pouring it in slow circles, as if writing invisible words. And they drizzle resins imported from faraway lands, frankincense and myrrh, carried by caravans that crossed blistering sands. It isn't just practical, it's performative. They're telling you without words that this recipe is worth more than gold, and you won't find it scribbled on any papyrus, because secrecy was the glue that held their power. Imagine if Coca-Cola had a workshop where every recipe was whispered in fragments across 3 people, no one holding the full formula, just enough to keep the fizz alive for eternity. That's the vibe here. The oddest part is how ordinary the powders look when they spill, little piles of gray, black, yellow, like the contents of a junk drawer. And yet you watch them stir it all together with a reverence that makes you second guess. Historians still debate whether every embalmer knew the exact purpose of each substance. Did one resin stop decay? Did another mask the smell? Did a third please the gods? No one agrees, and you can feel why. The embalmers themselves didn't want you to know. They treated their knowledge like a locked chest, and every time you think you're close, the lid slams shut. You remember how other civilizations played with recipes of preservation. In ancient China, royal tombs were sometimes sealed with layers of mercury, shimmering rivers of liquid metal poured around coffins like toxic moats. In Peru, the Nazca people used smoke to harden bodies into leathery forms, as if fire could bargain with time. Even in medieval Europe, apothecaries filled jars with spices, cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, believing they held not just flavor, but power over rot. And then, of course, there's the Victorians with their obsession for arsenic-based embalming fluids, which worked so well that preserved bodies still glow with poison centuries later, making you think twice about attending a fancy 19th century dinner party. Back in Egypt, though, the recipes live in the smoke curling above the fire. The embalmers toss herbs in, and the flames leap higher, carrying scents that sting your eyes. You imagine the gods watching, inhaling, judging, deciding whether the smoke smells worthy of eternity. And then you notice one embalmer slip something into the mix with an oddly casual motion, like tossing a pinch of salt over his shoulder. You lean closer, but you can't identify it. Was it ground cedar? Was it tar? Or was it just sand to throw you off the trail? It's the small, odd details like that which make you realize you're never going to have the whole recipe. No matter how long you watch, historians still debate whether the secrecy was religious, protecting the sanctity of the ritual, or economic, keeping embalming an exclusive business only priests could profit from. Maybe it was both. After all, knowledge is currency, and if you knew how to keep a pharaoh looking fresh for eternity, you didn't just have a job, you had leverage. Think of it like owning the only air fryer in town. Suddenly, you're not just a cook, you're a gatekeeper. The rhythm of the work lulls you. One embalmer grinds powders in a stone mortar, the sound like distant thunder, while another stirs resin with a wooden stick, slow, steady, hypnotic. The air grows thicker, hotter, and you feel sweat slide down your back as if the desert itself has crawled inside the room. You blink heavy-lidded, watching the motions repeat over and over until it's less about the recipe and more about the ritual. The hands move, the smoke rises, the jars wait, and the body on the table becomes part of the cycle. Then a thought hits you. What if they didn't care about perfection? What if embalming wasn't about preserving bodies exactly as they were, but about making them unrecognizable to time, confusing decay itself until it gave up? Maybe the secrecy wasn't about hiding recipes from people like you, but about hiding the logic from death itself. It's the kind of open-ended riddle historians love to debate at conferences, preferably over overpriced coffee. But you, standing here in the haze, don't need a conference paper. You feel it in your chest. The knowledge isn't lost. It's deliberately obscured, like a magician showing you the dove, but never the trick. Your eyelids sink heavier as you watch another handful of resin melt into the fire, and the smoke curls lazily upward, thick and sweet, like the room itself is exhaling. You imagine every wisp carrying secrets you'll never catch, rising higher and higher until they vanish into the rafters, leaving you with nothing but the slow, sticky rhythm of hands stirring, powders grinding, and mysteries thick as honey coating your throat. You think you've seen it all in this chamber of smoke and jars, but then something odd happens. The walls seem to thin, and suddenly you're not in Egypt anymore. You're floating sideways through centuries, slipping into other rooms where death was dressed up in different costumes, where embalmers and shamans and priests all claimed they had the only true key to cheating decay. The hook hits you instantly. What if secrets weren't meant to stay in one place? What if each civilization held a piece of the same riddle, passing it on like a torch, but always hiding half the flame? That thought makes you lean forward, because now you're curious. How many recipes for eternity are buried under histories? Dust? The first place you land is the high cliffs of Peru, where the Chinchorro people prepared their dead 6,000 years ago, long before Egyptians ever wrapped their first linen bandage. You see them peeling skin carefully, packing the body with reeds and clay, and painting the face with red ochre until it looks like a mask staring back at you. The smell here isn't resin. It's damp clay and sea air mixed with the quiet rustle of wind through desert grasses. It's so unsettling and yet so ordinary, as if they believe that by reassembling the body like a puzzle, they were reminding death it didn't get the last word. The hottest part? Some of those mummies were children, cared for with the same detail, their faces painted with love and dread, and you realize that the instinct to hold on never respected age. Historians still debate whether these practices were meant for religion, for community identity, or just the refusal to let grief win. Before you can linger, the floor tilts again, and you're dropped into the cool stone of an ancient Chinese tomb, lacquered coffins stacked like treasures, and the air heavy with the glint of mercury that glows faintly in the lamplight. Your throat tightens because you know mercury is poison, and yet here was poured in rivers around the resting place of emperors, sealing them like bugs in amber. Was it protection? Was it a misguided science experiment? Historians argue about. Whether they thought mercury preserved or whether it simply symbolized immortality, a metal as slippery and eternal as a god's promise. You cough, half imagining your lungs filling with invisible vapor, and can't help but joke that if OSHA existed back then, the inspectors would have fainted on the spot. The hook sharpens again when you tumble into medieval Europe, where monks sometimes boiled the flesh off bodies to ship bones across continents, because bones were holy, relics to be kissed and prayed over. The steam curls up from cauldrons and cloisters, smelling faintly of broth, and you try not to gag because the scene looks uncomfortably like a kitchen at lunchtime. The odd detail is that sometimes they used wine in the process, as if seasoning the soup of sainthood, and you can't help but picture a monk muttering, "A little Chianti will do the trick." Historians still debate whether this was out of devotion or simple practicality, but either way, the secrecy was real. Not everyone was supposed to know how the flesh was stripped, only that the bones arrived gleaming, worthy of reverence. And then snap you're in Polynesia, where tattooed guardians sang over preserved heads, carefully smoked and treated, until the features hardened into something both eerie and familiar. The hook digs deeper here, because it's not just about preservation. It's about memory you can touch, a face that still meets your eyes centuries later. The oddest part is how the heads were sometimes traded, passed like tokens of honor or war, and you realize that death itself could become currency. Historians still debate whether this was sacred or political, but either way, the secrecy of technique was fiercely guarded, whispered from one generation to the next. You drift back toward Egypt in your mind, but now the embalming chamber feels bigger, wider, connected to all these other places. The smoke rising from the resin doesn't just curl toward the ceiling. It threads across oceans, linking cultures that never met, weaving a story of humans who all asked the same question. How do we keep the ones we love from disappearing? And maybe that's the strongest hook of all. You're not just watching embalming anymore. You're watching humanity itself, tugging at the edges of time, trying to outwit decay with clay, with mercury, with wine, with smoke. Your eyelids feel heavy again, but the curiosity keeps them open a moment longer. You realize every civilization left a breadcrumb trail of secrets, and most of them are half-burned, half-lost, as if the world itself didn't want us to solve the puzzle all at once. And maybe that's the point. The embalmers in Egypt didn't just hide their recipes. They were part of a larger chorus of keepers, all of them humming the same unfinished tune, one you can almost hear if you let the smoke fill your ears. Jars, the resins, the painted faces, they're not isolated mysteries. They're notes in a global symphony of silence. And you? You're just lucky enough to be listening in? You blink slowly, and when your eyes open again, the glow of firelight has shifted into something dimmer, colder, as if centuries have swept by while you weren't looking, and suddenly you're not in the desert anymore, but inside a medieval chamber that smells of candle wax, ink, and dust. Here the obsession with death hasn't vanished. It's just changed costume, slipping into the long robes of monks and the locked cabinets of collectors. You shuffle closer and see a wooden cabinet with glass panes, the kind that creaks when opened, and inside are oddities that make your stomach turn and your curiosity lean in harder. Jars of dried organs, preserved animal fetuses floating in, cloudy liquid alongside seashells, feathers, and the occasional saint's finger wrapped like a relic in velvet. The hook is strong. You realize this isn't just about embalming anymore. It's about curiosity that won't die. Curiosity that needs to poke, prod, and preserve. And you think, what if secrets from Egypt leaked here, smuggled through whispered? Books or the odd merchant bragging over ale, reappearing centuries later in collections that claim to be about God, but were really about power. The odd detail that sticks in your mind is how some monks believed that the incorruptibility of a body proved holiness. You could almost hear them muttering prayers over a corpse that stubbornly refused to rot, and you picture a gathering of robed men poking cautiously at the skin, whispering miracle, while someone at the back of the group secretly wonders if the embalmer had just been very, very good at his job. Historians still debate whether certain incorruptible saints were natural phenomena or carefully preserved, and the line between faith and trickery feels thinner than a parchment page. You drift along stone corridors and find yourself in the study of a Renaissance physician, shelves lined with books and cabinets stacked with specimens. Here the embalmer's secrets are being reinvented as science, though not everyone agrees on what science means. You watch as he opens a jar containing what looks like a shriveled heart, holds it up to the candle, and scribbles notes in Latin. He doesn't smile, he looks hungry. Not for food, but for knowledge. And you realize that the embalmer's old silence is being cracked open, dissected, cataloged. Yet even here, secrecy lingers. Recipes for preservation are guarded, traded, or hinted at in cryptic margins, as if too much clarity might offend the balance between reverence and curiosity. Your mind wanders to cabinets of curiosity across Europe, where nobles and scholars competed to show off collections of bizarre things. A crocodile hanging from the ceiling, a jar of dried tongues, a taxidermied two-headed calf, and yes, sometimes, mummified fragments from Egypt itself smuggled through trade routes. You almost laugh, because it feels like the ancient embalmer's work had been downgraded from holy ritual to party trick for the wealthy. Imagine being an Egyptian priest watching your sacred jar of resin-coated intestines end up next to a stuffed parrot in a German prince's study. That's the dark comedy of history. It takes what was once divine and turns it into decor. The cabinets aren't just oddities. They're battlegrounds. Scholars argue over whether these preserved remains reveal God's design or whether they hint at natural laws independent of heaven. You hear voices rising in debate, Latin phrases bouncing off stone walls, and realize that even in this era, secrecy hasn't vanished. It's just been transformed into academic rivalry. One scholar whispers his embalming recipe only to trust it. Students. Another brags in public, but conveniently omits key steps, leaving rivals fumbling. Historians still debate whether some of the so-called medical recipes of the time actually worked, or whether they were half-remembered echoes of Egyptian techniques, diluted across centuries like ink in water, that you catch yourself staring at a cabinet corner where something small sits, easy to miss. A shriveled hand, its fingernails still faintly visible, tucked beside a seashell. It's such an odd pairing, the fragile remains of a person next to something pulled from the ocean, and yet it makes a strange kind of sense. Both are shells. After all, one once held a life. The other still smells faintly of salt. You think, about how people everywhere cling to shells, bones, jars, as if surrounding themselves with pieces of the world could hold chaos at bay. And maybe that's what all these cabinets were about, pretending you could catalog the universe, line it up on shelves, and keep death from scattering it into dust. The air here is heavy, thick with the must of centuries, but your eyelids sag. With the same rhythm you felt in Egypt, the slow repetition of hands, jars, rituals. Only now the lullaby isn't resin and linen. It's the scratching of quills, the creak of cabinet doors, the low murmur of monks wondering whether the body in their care is a miracle or just really well salted. And as you drift closer to sleep, you realize the embalmer's secret didn't die. It just put on new robes, new masks, slipping quietly into monasteries and studies, waiting for someone like you to notice. The candles of the monasteries flicker out, and when you open your eyes again, the world has jumped forward into the gaslit streets of the 19th century, where embalming has staged a comeback with more flair, more chemicals, and more secrecy than ever before. You hear the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the hiss of steam engines, and beneath it all the hushed chatter of funeral parlors, where bodies are being prepared not for eternity, in pyramids, but for viewing parlors and drawing rooms. Because Victorians had a peculiar habit of wanting to spend one last evening with their dearly departed. You lean in, and the hook is immediate. What if death wasn't hidden in tombs anymore, but displayed right in the living room, polished and perfumed for guests to admire? The thought makes you shift uncomfortably, because embalming here is less about pleasing gods and more about appearances. And that somehow feels even stranger. The American Civil War becomes your next stop, and it's a battlefield drenched in smoke and sorrow. Here embalmers traveled with armies, their wagons rattling across mud, offering their services to grieving families who wanted sons shipped home intact. You see one embalmer bent over a soldier, syringes and scalpels gleaming, and you realize the secrecy of recipe hasn't gone away. It's just become a trade secret, guarded by traveling morticians who relied on mystery to keep competitors at bay. The odd detail that sticks in your mind is how some embalmers would hand out business cards right on the battlefield, as if offering a loyalty program for grieving generals, a mix of grotesque practicality and marketing genius. Historians still debate whether the widespread popularity of embalming began here, out of necessity, or whether the Civil War simply revealed a fascination that had always been lurking. You drift from the battlefield to a Victorian parlor in London, where velvet curtains are drawn and a chandelier throws dim light over a body dressed in its finest. Here arsenic-based embalming fluids have done their work, preserving the flesh with eerie smoothness. You lean closer, and the smell is chemical, metallic, nothing like the sweet resins of Egypt. Its efficiency masquerading as dignity, and you can't help but think of the irony. Arsenic, a poison that killed countless people in life, was now being used to keep them intact in death. Imagine attending a wake and realizing the body next to you is basically a walking Superfund site. The oddest part is that these techniques were so effective that some bodies still leak arsenic today, centuries later, making archaeologists mutter curses as they crack open coffins. Historians still debate whether the popularity of arsenic embalming was about science, fashion, or simply a society that couldn't admit how uncomfortable it was with decay. And the secrecy of it all. The embalming manuals of the time were often vague, full of lofty promises, but missing exact formulas, as if each embalmer wanted to hold on to the one ingredient that gave him an edge. You imagine Victorian morticians leaning across shop counters, whispering about special blends, the way baristas brag about coffee beans, each recipe a guarded brand. The hook grabs you again when you realize this isn't so different from Egypt. The materials have changed. The gods have been replaced by chemistry, but the culture of secrecy is exactly the same. You drift further, now into the homes of ordinary Victorians, where death photography has become fashionable. Families pose with the embalmed, dressing them carefully, sitting them upright, even holding children in their laps as if the boundary between living and dead had softened into a theatrical tableau. You blink, and it unsettles you, not because of the death, but because of the way everyone stares at the camera as if daring you to say it's wrong. The embalmer's craft was what made this possible. What kept faces smooth long enough for photographs to be taken? What turned grief into a portrait? The oddest part is that sometimes the dead looked more alive in these photos than the exhausted family members holding them. Historians still debate whether this practice was a coping mechanism or a cultural quirk. But either way, the embalmer's unseen hand is in every frame. The rhythm of this era is different from Egypt, but just as hypnotic. The hiss of chemicals poured into veins, the scratch of pens signing contracts, the soft shuffle of mourners' shoes against carpet. You sit with it a while, the mixture of science and spectacle. The way embalming has become not a ritual for gods, but a service for customers. And as your eyelids grow heavier, you realize that the embalmer's secret never truly belonged to any single time or culture. It slipped from pyramids to battlefields, from jars to arsenic bottles, always hiding, always selling, always reminding you that death might be universal, but the way humans fight it is endlessly inventive, endlessly strange. You open your eyes again, and the kerosene lamps of the Victorian parlor fade into the cold, clinical glow of modern laboratories, where embalming tables are replaced with stainless steel counters, and the air hums not with incense or arsenic, fumes, but with the steady buzz of machines scanning what human hands once hid. The hook hits fast. You're watching science pry into mysteries that embalmers swore would never be revealed, and it feels like eavesdropping on a conversation 4,000 years in the making. You lean in because the story has changed. Now, it's not priests with linen strips or morticians with syringes, but chemists, radiologists, and archaeologists armed with microscopes and CT scanners, peeling back layers of secrecy molecule by molecule. The body of a pharaoh lies inside a machine, the scan lighting up organs that were tucked away thousands of years ago, and you realize you're seeing what no embalmer ever intended: the fingerprints of their craft glowing on screens in shades of blue and red. The odd detail that sticks in your head is how some scans reveal resin poured so hot that the body's skin actually scorched, as if eternity had a smell of burning pine. Historians still debate whether this was intentional part of a fiery purification, or simply the embalmer rushing the process. A reminder that even sacred rituals sometimes came down to sloppy work. You drift across continents to labs in Germany and Britain, where chemists grind crumbs of ancient bandages into powder, then run them through spectrometers, each machine humming like an electronic priest, reciting prayers and wavelengths. The results spill out: traces of cedar oil, juniper, beeswax, even exotic resins imported from Asia or sub-Saharan Africa. That means embalming wasn't just a ritual. It was global trade disguised as sacred practice, a marketplace smuggled into eternity. The hook tightens. You realize that every preserved organ wasn't just an act of devotion, but also a receipt for goods carried across deserts and seas. And you can't help but imagine the arguments that must have raged in workshops when the right resin shipment didn't arrive on time. You're pulled into another lab, this one filled with glass vials, where scientists dissolve flakes of mummy wrappings in solvents, trying to coax out hidden recipes. The smell is chemical, sterile, nothing like the fixed sweetness of resin smoke, but the secrets still rise. One odd finding: animal fats, sometimes mixed with plant oils, a detail that makes you blink, because the ancient embalmers weren't afraid to blend kitchen ingredients with sacred chemistry. Historians still debate whether these mixtures were symbolic, representing balance between animal and plant worlds, or whether they were simply practical improvisations. The idea that the recipe for immortality might have come down to something as ordinary as beef tallow makes. You smirk. It's like discovering the secret of Coca-Cola was just sugar and fizz all along. And then you're at a conference room, not a tomb where scholars argue over PowerPoint slides instead of papyrus. One insists that resins were chosen for antimicrobial properties. Another swears it was all symbolic. Another waves chemical data like a sword. You almost laugh because the debates feel exactly like the priests in Egypt whispering half-truths to each other different millennium. Same secrecy, just with more coffee. The odd detail that lodges in your mind is that some of these conferences serve snacks next to displays of mummy chemistry, so you're literally eating cookies while staring at the preserved liver of a king. History has never had good manners. You step back and realize the hook here isn't just the science. It's the idea that even with all our machines, we're still guessing. The scans, the tests, the debates, they reveal fragments, but never the whole. Just as the embalmers intended, the full recipe for eternity stays out of reach, hidden not in jars this time, but in the silence of what can't be measured. You feel your eyelids heavy again as the hum of machines lulls you, steady and low, like a lullaby played in radio static. The embalmer's secrets are still secrets, even when you translate them into data points. And as you drift toward sleep, you realize that the real mystery isn't what they used, but why they guarded it so fiercely. A question science can't answer, no matter how strong the microscope. You think the machines will give you closure, that the glow of the CT scans and the hum of spectrometers will finally unlock every jar and unwrap every strip of linen. But instead, what you feel is a strange emptiness, as if the closer you get to answers, the more the questions multiply. The hook grabs you hard here. What if the real trick of the embalmers wasn't just their recipe, but the fact that they built the process to remain unsolved, to keep you chasing shadows long after their own bones had turned to dust? You lean in, because this is the edge of knowledge, the place where curiosity bangs against the wall of mystery, and you can almost hear the embalmers laughing quietly through the smoke of time. There are debates everywhere you turn. One historian insists the absence of the brain in mummies shows contempt for thought. Another swears it was a practical choice, while a third argues it must have been symbolic. Proof that wisdom wasn't in the skull at all, but in the heart. None of them agree, and you realize the silence of the embalmers is still winning. You picture the jars again, lined up neatly, each organ humming its own mute tune, and you understand that half the power was always in withholding. Secrets don't survive by accident. They survive because someone wanted them to. The oddest details still trip you up. A recent study finds traces of pine resin in tombs that never had pine trees nearby, meaning trade was wider than anyone thought. Another scan reveals a mummy stuffed with mud instead of organs, raising eyebrows about whether this was reverence or fraud. You almost laugh at the thought that ancient embalmers might have had scams, just like shady contractors today. Pay full price for deluxe preservation, while secretly swapping cedar oil for sand. Historians still debate whether these anomalies show different social classes at work, or whether we're misinterpreting what was deliberate ritual. And then there's the larger world beyond Egypt. You remember the Chinchorro, the Chinese emperors. Sealed in mercury, the monks boiling bones, the Victorians posing with arsenic-preserved corpses. Every era tried to pin death down, and every era left gaps wide enough for mystery to leak through. The hook tightens again. Maybe the universality of secrecy is the point. Each civilization chose to keep its methods half-closed, like a magician, letting you glimpse the dove, but never the trick. You're left suspended between fascination and frustration, a tension that hums in your chest, like the low drone of desert wind. Your mind drifts back to that embalming chamber where it all began. The lamps flickering, the jars lined up, the linen strips waiting. You imagine leaning over to ask a priest, why this jar? Why this resin? And watching him smile without answering. Maybe he'd point at the smoke. Maybe he'd whisper something cryptic. Maybe he'd just walk away. And you realize the silence itself is part of the ritual. If you knew everything, it would stop working. Secrets lose power when they're explained, like a joke ruined by too much analysis. So you sit with the not knowing, and it becomes strangely soothing. You don't need the full recipe. You don't need to understand every detail of resin or salt. The mystery is enough. The hum of unanswered questions wrapping around you like linen strips, snug and comforting. You think about how each civilization added a verse to the same unfinished song, and how your role isn't to finish it, but simply to listen as it fades into the distance. Your eyelids close heavier now, the images blurring into one another. Jars painted with baboon faces, Chinese tombs shimmering with mercury, monks stirring cauldrons, Victorian parlors lined with velvet, modern labs glowing with screens. They all collapse into a single haze, a tapestry of secrets stitched from smoke, resin, salt, and silence. And the last thing you feel before sleep takes you is the odd comfort that some mysteries are meant to stay mysteries, that some secrets are meant to be kept forever, humming softly in the dark. Now slow down, breathe. Let the words stretch like warm cloth across your shoulders. The room you're in is dim and quiet, the kind of quiet that softens edges and blurs thoughts. The jars, the resins, the smoke, they all drift further away, leaving nothing but a soft hum, like wind over sand or water lapping against stone. You don't need to hold on to the details. You don't need to solve the puzzle. You can let it fade just like every civilization. Let its secrets slip into silence. Each breath grows longer, heavier, the world softer, the edges gentler, until the story itself feels like linen wrapping you snugly, layer by layer, until you're cocooned in rest. You are safe, you are still, you are allowed to let go. The mysteries will keep humming without you, and you can drift slowly, easily into sleep. End of script. Good night.